Hi guys, today going to be expanding on the marketplace with a few beast cages and a few crates as well. And to start with some plasticard and cutting a few rectangles out of that. Making sure they are reasonably good sized and then using a pin vise to drill some holes through both the pieces of plasticard at once so you get the same holes on each end. I found it was easier to fully drill the top piece and use that as a template and then drill down into the lower piece through those same holes. And once you've got those holes lining up, using cocktail sticks and pushing them through. And these create the bars of the cage. I secured the lower portion just by cutting the cocktail sticks flush and then dabbing a little bit of super glue over the ends. On the top part, I removed it from the sticks and cut a rectangular hole in the middle, so I'd be able to put something inside later. I made a smaller cage with a leftover cube of styrofoam. I got some cocktail sticks, trimmed them down to size, and then imprinted them with the right shape so I could glue them slightly embedded into the sides, and using matte Mod Podge as the glue medium. I made one more by connecting strips of plasticard together, then using the same process, just connected a few bits of plasticard together to form a lid for the first cage. Moving on to the crates, I got some pieces of balsa wood, and using a cocktail stick, I pushed some wood grain texture in, as well as define between the planks themselves. I also glued some pieces of foam together to act as a core for the box, which I then assembled with hot glue. I wanted there to be something escaping from inside the box, so with a pair of clippers I mangled the bottom part, so there would be room for a tentacle emerging from the bottom of the crate. I then added a few details using some spare offcuts of balsa. I wanted two stands for this, so with some rectangles of foam core, cut them first into an oval shape, and then bevel the edges so they'd blend into a board. Now my normal method is to make the base first, then build on top of that, but when you're making sort of little greeble bits, and that's the main part of the build, I find building those bits first and then building a base of an appropriate size is probably the way to go with that. To give me a level surface, I took some bits of balsa wood planking and glued them into a rough line on each of the bases. So this gives you a level platform to build on, and it makes an interesting little feature that is sort of a recurring theme for my post-apocalyptic town. Once I was happy with the layout, I started attaching everything together using hot glue. I also realised the plasticard cage probably needed a base, so I attached a square of plasticard and then used plastic glue to give a more secure bond to the cage above it. I then mixed up a basing paste and used this to blend the base of the models together. and you can get a nice effect by overlapping some of the wooden planking, as well as building up on the sides of some of the pieces. This is the forgiving part of doing apocalyptic stuff, is that if you do something that looks messy or you get too much basing paste or dirt somewhere, it often looks intentional and fits the theme. This is a step I sometimes forget, but while the basing paste is still drying, taking some small aquarium rocks and partially submerging them into the paste. And once the basing paste is dry, going in and hitting the rest of the build with a base coat of black gesso to act as a base layer and a primer. And I find when you're treating the balsa wood parts, it's a little easier to water down the black gesso some, which makes it a lot easier to be absorbed by the balsa wood. Then coating the entire piece with a mid-brown. I used a large soft brush for this, so it would more easily pick out a lot of the details on the basing paste and the wood grain. While this dried, I moved on to the contents of the cages. So I 3D printed a variety of bits I had left over. So I had some animals from Wargames Atlantic, as well as a few things I'd sculpted myself, such as this giant mutant spider, and the weird large maggot things. So, with some Vallejo surface primer, went in and gave those a prime. Moving back to the cages, and gave them a quick, slightly watery coat of metallic silver colour. For the wood in the basing paste, I then mixed up a beige, pale sand colour, and gave it a very light coat over the dirt, as well as on the wooden features, and overlapped slightly with the base of the metallics, where they connected. For the tentacle, I was initially going to use Milliput, but I decided I could probably just use styrofoam instead, so I sculpted a little wormy snake fella out of styrofoam. And I gave it a quick squeeze with my fingers, just to make it a bit more compressed, and rounded in its shape. Moving back to the minis once they've had 24 hours to dry, and going for a very simple colour scheme for a lot of these, of one base colour and then a dry brush over the top with a very large brush. And for the spiders, decided to go for a blue-grey, followed by a very bright green, but hitting only on the top side of the model, so you get a bit of a gradient build-up, and it highlights the details on the top. There's no need to go too in-depth, as for the most part these things will be hidden inside the cage. But it does give you a good opportunity to use some colours that aren't just brown. Although, speaking of brown, I used that as a base coat for the maggots, and then went in with a light beige and gave it a dry brush over the top. For the base of the maggot cage, I wanted it to be a bit gross and mucusy, so I took some green, some beige and some browns, dabbed them down, didn't mix them together too much, and then applied some drops of water over the top, so you get a nice kind of swirly, horrible, mucusy substance at the bottom of the cage. And once that had dried, using a few dabs of Mod Podge, and then poke the maggots down into it. I also had to clip a small portion of the cage out so I could fit the mutant spider in, because I did want it to be a bit big for the cage, and that seemed to be the easiest way to do that. And then very carefully gluing that down in place. I then attached the dog on top of one of the crates so he could supervise the operation. Then, using a mixture of water, PVA, and some green acrylic paint, I dipped in some tissue, then used this as a cloth over the top of some of the boxes, and used it to cover up the back of the crate where it was just styrofoam showing through. To make the maggots extra shiny and gross, I used some Vallejo water texture and put a few drops into the enclosure, so they would be shiny and it would give a level of depth to the mucousy base layer. I then used a bit of the excess to make the tentacle shiny as well. Once that was all dried, I felt the canvas wasn't quite the right colour, so I went in with a watered down green paint and went over the top of it. I wanted a colour that was a bit more sunburnt and worn out, whereas that green looked a bit too kind of manufactured and synthetic. I also used a watered down black paint to add a bit of weathering to the metallics and give it a nice dark patina. Once that was dry, I was happy with the build. So, 2 more stalls to add to the marketplace, and the canvas does look a bit bright on the camera, but it is a bit less garish in person. Practically, these can be used as scatter terrain or cover, and most 28mm stuff should be able to see over the top of them. But potentially also has some fun interactions with the scenario if the caged beasts get out. Or could be used as an objective token if you need to capture some exotic pet. But they also just blend in quite nicely with the rest of the marketplace, and if you put them next to the meat stand, you get some questionable ethics. But anyway, thanks so much for watching guys, and I'll catch you next time.